We are having in room 1 the 10th anniversary of the Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information. And you may ask, why am I bringing that up? Well, what are they celebrating? It's the 10-year anniversary. And what they have done over the last 10 years, 158 countries and jurisdictions, is that they have eliminated bank secrecy for tax purposes. This is something that was unthinkable 10 years ago, and if we can do that, we can also get to zero carbon if we put our minds to it. So I just want to use that tax example as a sort of inspiration for everyone to think about this issue and see how we can really get to a zero carbon world. Although that requires a transition, as we'll hear from our very distinguished set of speakers.
So some of these countries have lots of oil and gas reserves. Think Nigeria, think Ghana, think Mexico, think Brazil, Mozambique soon. Then what should they do? Then they should really invest, they should diversify, so they should invest in stocks whose fortunes are inversely related to those of the oil markets. So they should really... Norway did it at one point, that they were investing heavily in oil and gas majors. And then so that was positively correlated with the return on oil underneath the ground. So then they recently changed it and they divested from the oil and gas majors. But maybe from a capital asset pricing motive, maybe you would move towards energy intensive companies, because if the oil prices really go low, you're not getting much for your products, but then they fare very well. So from a CAPM perspective, that would be a good idea. And of course, you would move towards renewable energy intensive industries. But the point is, if climate policy comes in, and we follow the advice of Ada Turner and of the Secretary General, and really have a high carbon tax. So something like, I would say, 100 euros per ton of CO2, growing at 2 or 3% a year for the next 30 years. Announce it, put it in a global constitution if we could. But then all the countries and companies who know where we're going to, you put a dot on the horizon, that's where we're going. And that's not the way it is. But that's what it should be. And that's why Ada Turner and others make the point so strongly. But then, of course, if that is properly priced, it isn't properly priced yet, then you move out of carbon-intensive companies towards renewable-intensive stocks. So then if you're holding, like many pension funds or like countries, you're holding all these old industries or old assets like coal, cement, aluminium, steel, in the Dutch context, maybe horticulture, all these greenhouses, which are financed by gas, then suddenly, you will want to move out of that. But you've invested a hell of a lot. And if you haven't invested, divested, changed your investment from brown to green early enough, you may get caught with your pants down. You will get the problem of stranded financial assets. All this stuff is very well discussed, I should say, in the OECD background paper by a number of people, which all of you, I can only recommend you read. So what can be done? Look at the second bullet. I think that's useful to mention here, because we need help, particularly for countries which are the developing countries are much more at risk, to mitigate those risks. Early warning systems, evacuation schemes, stronger building against earthquakes and other stuff, land use and zoning laws, fiscal incentives for climate-resistant crops. As I say, they have to switch to crops to be resilient. For air conditioning, maybe in other places, for housing improvements, and for irrigation drainages, sea defenses, etc. So there's a lot of stuff there, practical stuff, which we need to get our hands on. But particularly, we need safety nets for those affected by climate change. Not just those people living on near the close to the beaches or where all the floods are happening, but we need, it's the poorest people who are always affected most. It's not just the poorest people in London that are affected the most, it's the poorest countries that are affected the most. Asthma and those type of diseases might be an easy way to get something to become greener, because that's a more powerful political argument than climate change, because it affects local and not global.
I am pleased to share with you that the OECD Policy Dialogue released yesterday a publication on using extractive revenues for sustainable development policy guidance for research-rich countries. In order to translate finite assets into productive and long-lasting development gains, policymakers need to address two main challenges. The first challenge is how to reconcile long-term development and generational equity objectives with the need to manage the volatility and uncertainty of resource revenues. The second challenge is how to transform finite resource revenues into long-standing and productive development gains. In order to put research-rich developing countries on a sustainable development trajectory that outlives resource extraction. The establishment of the clear and the consistent fiscal policy framework can help to insulate the economy from price, production, or other external shocks and ensure medium or long-term fiscal sustainability. Stabilization funds provide a financial buffer when commodity markets collapse and the revenues from the national resource decline beyond the appropriate level of precautionary savings necessary to provide a financial buffer to ensure fiscal sustainability over time. Research-rich countries need to manage the trade-off between investing in the domestic economy abroad and saving for future generations. The policy dialogue is also investigating the role that institutional investors, such as sovereign wealth funds and strategic investments can play to mobilize resources to support low-carbon development pathways, thus helping to address long-term financing challenges and coping with the shrinking fiscal space while balancing policy and the commercial objectives.
We also highlighted that it's a very good practice that wealth funds diversify away from fossil fuel investments and they get into other areas. It could be renewables, but it can be other things as well. But I think it's important to break the link between what the economy is specialized in and where the money goes, which can be abroad. And this is an insurance policy. We, of course, supported, or we've been always advocating that it is healthy for any economy, and particularly for resource-rich economies, to focus on diversification, and Kazakhstan is doing some of that. We found there are economic opportunities in most of the economic sectors in which Kazakhstan has got a competitive advantage to go further and diversify away from oil and gas. We had some recommendations about fiscal consolidation. I suppose other speakers will speak about that later. Diversifying the tax base, getting rid of the fossil fuel subsidies, which are important in the case of Kazakhstan, not to speak about Egypt, where it was a major source of budget use in the country. And finally, and we didn't touch upon that here, but I think it's important to have long-term budget planning. Because the majority of the countries, their budget planning goes 2 to 3 years. Now, there are some impacts that are felt in 5 to 10 years. And even the IMF now is recommending these longer-term frameworks. And I think that's a very wise policy, particularly in the case of climate change risks. So one of the recommendations was to try and expand the forecasts to cover lengthier periods of time. One message I personally have learned to give every time we go to speak to a government, particularly if it has got strong interests in the oil, gas, in the fossil fuel sectors, is that we cannot only advocate climate change policies, we should also provide at least some recommendations or ideas of what can be done with the people and the sectors which are in areas that are going to disappear. So now there's a lot of talk on the national development contributions, which are these climate change plans on how to decarbonize the economies. I think in most countries it would be wise to add a chapter on how the potential losers of those green economy transition policies are going to be affected and what the country is planning to do to overcome these barriers. And there may be some groups where we think it's more legitimate than others to get compensation or somehow to be included in the debate, but there is no doubt that these things need to be taken into account. I'm thinking of coal miners, for example, which is something my bank is working extensively at the moment, but it also has to do, for example, with the vulnerable groups when climate change policies like fossil fuel, the removal of fossil fuel subsidies, what impact does this have on some groups of society? And what can be done to minimize these things?
We have a very ambitious policy on electrification of the road transport. So there's a policy target that all new passenger cars should be pure electric vehicles by 2025. It's a conditional target on technological progress, but we are in fact on a path to reach this ambition, because so far in 2019, 45% of all new passenger cars are pure electric vehicles. 45%. And it's up from 30% approximately last year. And in the stock of passenger cars, 10% of them are now pure electric vehicles. So how is this possible? Well, it's through very, very strong economic incentives. Electric vehicles are exempted from VAT. They are exempted from the registration tax, which in Norway is quite high. It could typically be 10,000 euros for a car. They are exempted from the annual ownership tax. And there is no fuel tax on electricity. There's the standard electricity tax, but that's very low compared to the fuel taxes.
So let me just take one example, Chad. It's more than 80%. They have been just producing oil only since 2003. If you take the Lake Chad, it has lost about 90% of its size since 1960. Between 1960 to 2010, it has lost 90% of its size. So it has shrunk significantly. And that means that all the populations living around the lake, whether from Cameroon, Chad, Niger, Nigeria, and so on, that is a climate crisis today. With populations who have to move and fighting for dwindling resources, about water, about grazing, and all the rest of it. That is a crisis today, not a semantic discussion. Now, at the same time, you have the same government that takes more than 80% of its revenues from oil exports. So it's a very challenging issue, the transition from high carbon to low carbon economies. We will not get into the issue of equity or inequity that's related to this issue, because we know that the largest polluters and those who will suffer the most are not always the same, both across countries and within countries, between urban and rural populations and so on. But from our perspective at the EITI, maybe it's the love instrument. We for every problem we think if you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So for us here, we have transparency and data. So the main point that we think we can contribute is promoting evidence-based policies